Good morning. You can be opening your Bibles to Ezekiel 47. And what I want to share this morning is one of the most, for me, impactful texts in the prophecies of the Old Testament that say something about the mission of Christ and the mission of each one of us as Christians. In the first century, whenever the Christians would gather together and they would have different scrolls from the Old Testament. And Paul would go from synagogue to synagogue and he'd be preaching to people and converting people. They didn't have all of the New Testament written down, but what they would have had would have been a lot of these Old Testament prophecies, all these Old Testament books, that they would have been able to go back to and look at, whichever ones were accessible to those people in those different places. And from passages in the Old Testament, learn something about what God was always wanting to create. We can look at the Old Testament to see prophecies of what Jesus was going to come and do, and we need to look at those. But we can also look at prophecies in the Old Testament to see what God always wanted his people to be like. And in that way, you can learn a lot about New Testament Christianity by seeing these pictures and these visions of what God always wanted his people to be like. At the beginning and the end of the Bible, there are passages that talk about a river. In the Garden of Eden, there was a river, and from that river, I guess Adam and Eve would have used the strength from that river to cultivate the garden all over the world, had everything gone exactly according to the way God commanded them. And then at the end of the Bible, in Revelation 22, there is this river of life that issues forth from the throne of God that brings healing to the nations. And those two river passages at the beginning and the end of the Bible, I think, are more well known. What maybe is not as well known is this passage here in Ezekiel 47, 1 through 12. How many of you have gone back to this passage and gone, okay, now I know what my purpose is in life? This is not one of those passages that is commonly discussed, but for me, this has been something that has impacted the way that I look at the way that I try to serve God and what it means to be a Christian. So let's go ahead and read Ezekiel 47, verses 1 through 12. And after I read this, I'll set the context of what we're looking at in the book of Ezekiel and kind of funnel down to the lessons that we're going to look at. But look at Ezekiel 47, starting in verse 1. Then he brought me back to the door of the temple, and behold, water was issuing from below the threshold of the temple toward the east, for the temple faced east. The water was flowing down from below the south end of the threshold of the temple, south of the altar. Then he brought me out by way of the north gate, and led me around on the outside to the outer gate that faces toward the east. And behold, the water was trickling out on the south side. Going on eastward with a measuring line in his hand, the man measured 1,000 cubits, and then led me through the water, and it was ankle deep. Again he measured 1,000, and led me through the water, and it was knee deep. Again he measured 1,000, and led me through the water, and it was waist deep. Again he measured 1,000, and it was a river that I could not pass through, for the water had risen. It was deep enough to swim in, a river that could not be passed through. And he said to me, Son of man, have you seen this? Then he led me back to the bank of the river. As I went back, I saw on the bank of the river very many trees on the one side and on the other. And he said to me, This water flows toward the eastern region and goes down into the Arabah and enters the sea. When the water flows into the sea, the water will become fresh. And wherever the river goes, every living creature that swarms will live, and there will be very many fish. For this water goes there, that the waters of the sea may become fresh, so everything will live where the river goes. Fishermen will stand beside the sea, from En-Gedi to Eneglaim. It will be a place for the spreading of nets. Its fish will be of very many kinds, like the fish of the great sea. But its swamps and marshes will not become fresh, for they are left for salt. And on the banks of both sides of the river there will grow all kinds of fruit trees. Their leaves will not wither, nor their fruit fail, but they will bear fresh fruit every month, because the water for them flows from the sanctuary. Their fruit will be for food, and their leaves for healing. We've more or less just kind of plucked this passage out of what is obviously a lot of things going on in the book of Ezekiel. Ezekiel, we learn from the very beginning of the book that he was taken into exile. In Ezekiel chapter 1, verse 1, he says, "As I was among the exiles by the Kibar Canal, the heavens were opened, and I saw visions of God." Ezekiel is a prophet. He's also a priest. He's been taken into captivity. And he's by this Kibar Canal, which would have been one of the major roadways for the Babylonians near that area. And the Babylonians had come, and they had come 3 times. In total, they're going to come 3 times to the Israelites and take away a bunch of people captive and bring them to the land of Babylon. Now, Ezekiel was taken in the second captivity. And in this second captivity, what he's doing for God and his fellow people that are in exile is he's acting as like a prophetic news anchor. He's going and getting visions from God, and while he's hanging out with these fellow Israelites along the Kibar Canal, and they could see the next wave of Babylonians going and besieging Jerusalem and going over and destroying them, he would have been the guy in exile that was giving all of these people the latest updates on what's going to happen to our people. And so the message of the book of Ezekiel is chapters 1 through 32 is judgment. He's in exile with these people, and he's saying, hey guys, we deserve to be judged. We've committed adultery. We've committed idolatry. We've not been pleasing the Lord like he's asked us to. It's in these chapters that we get really vivid pictures, like Ezekiel chapter 16, for example, where it talks about the nation of Israel being compared to a little girl that was thrown on the side of the road shortly after her birth, and nobody cared for her. And then God came and gave her life and made her beautiful and flourish, but then she cheated on the God who gave her life. And there's other pictures that talk about how everything that is coming our way as far as judgment is completely deserved. But so often in the prophets, in all of the prophets, they're very balanced preachers. Have you ever heard some preachers where the only thing they can talk about is love and mercy and grace, but they never talk about judgment? And then you know the other preachers that only talk about judgment and hell and all that kind of thing? What the prophets in the Old Testament would do is they would talk about judgment, but they would always also talk about restoration and grace. So beginning around chapter 33, Ezekiel says, God's going to take care of the bad shepherds that we have. He's going to restore us. He's going to bring us back to the land. There's going to be blessings for us. That's the overall message of what we're looking at. So this text that we just read in Ezekiel 47 comes in this section of the nation being restored and blessed. But threaded through these 2 sections of Ezekiel, you've got this picture of God's temple and what's happening in the temple. In the first half of the book, the temple, which is where God is supposed to be worshiped, has become a place of idolatry so that God has to pack his bags and leave. In Ezekiel 10, verse 18, it says, "Then the glory of the Lord went out from the threshold of the house and stood over the cherubim, and there God is vacating the temple, leaving it vulnerable for the Babylonians to come and finally destroy it." And so God, whenever God is not honored in his temple, God vacates. By the way, if the Bible, you can start to see some of where we're going in this lesson. If the Bible teaches that we are a temple of God, what is it that God does with temples that are filled with idolatry? He does not stay in them. God's presence does not remain in such people, but he leaves and gives you vulnerability to be judged one day. But in the restoration section, the final words of the book of Ezekiel say, "The Lord is there." Well, where is the Lord? The Lord is there, beginning in Ezekiel 40 and going through chapter 48. You've got this restored temple. This temple that is functioning the way that the temple was always supposed to function. A temple that has God honored at it, that God's presence is in it and is doing the work that it's supposed to do. And so I want you to imagine this, and I got this picture up here of what Ezekiel is seeing, something like this, I suppose. Ezekiel is at the entrance over here inside the temple courts or something like that, And he sees this water issuing from below this threshold going towards the east. And by the way, do you remember in the book of Genesis, whenever people sin, what direction do they go? They go east, east of Eden, east of Nob, all these different places that people get sent to. And here, this water is headed towards that direction that sin has gone in the Old Testament. So Ezekiel sees this little trickle of water coming. And he exits by the north gate. Ezekiel, I think it's chapter 43, says that the east gate is the Lord's. So he goes through the north gate over here. You can imagine him walking all the way around. And he goes over here, and he goes, well, okay, I see that this trickle of water is continuing. And there's this angelic figure or something that says, okay, I want you to go 1,000 cubits, 1,500 feet, about a third of a mile. And you can imagine Ezekiel, he keeps walking out this way, and if the PowerPoint thing could be bigger, it would go, all the way over to that emergency door or whatever. And so Ezekiel keeps walking out further and further, and this little trickle of water has become deep enough where it's ankle deep. Hear it in your mind, him sloshing around in the water, and he just looking around like, where there's no tributary waters adding to this. This little trickle of water has become this. How has this happened? And he stops after he's gone 1,000 cubits. This angel says again, go another 1,000 cubits, go another 1,500 feet, Ezekiel. And now it's getting harder to walk because it's become knee deep. Go again a third time, waist deep now. Now it's really, I'm kind of swimming a little bit at this point. He goes, for a fourth time, Ezekiel's told to go 1 1/3 mile. And now he can't cross through it because it's become this raging torrent, this a huge amount of water that I can't swim in anymore. And Ezekiel gets to the bank of the river that has started with this trickle. And this angel says this question, which I think is an important question for us to all think about. Have you seen this? Son of man, have you seen this? Ask yourself that question. Have you seen this before? Have you seen what this means for you? Have you seen what this symbolizes for you? And as Ezekiel is taking in the whole vision, I imagine him sitting up on the bank and the water's dripping off of him. And he's sitting up there and he looks out further and he sees that there's just suddenly rows of trees on either side of the river. And as he keeps looking out, I maybe he pulls out some binoculars or something. He says, oh, wow, that water is going towards the sea. Which sea is so famous that you don't even have to specify which one it is that's headed east? This would be the Dead Sea, the lowest point on earth below sea level, 1,400 feet. This sea is made up of 35% minerals and salt and things like that. If you go into the ocean, go swimming in the ocean, and you know how much salt gets on your lips, and you're like, oh, that tastes bad and everything. That's 3.5% salt and minerals. This is 35%. And here, Ezekiel sees this little trickle of water that started from the sanctuary of God, and it's going towards this Dead Sea, and it's transforming it, and it's giving it life. Nobody had gone fishing here in thousands of years, but suddenly there's very many fish. There's fishermen everywhere with their nets everywhere. This place is teeming with life now. Now, did you notice that in verse 11, there are still swamps and marshes, and it says that they're going to be left there for the salt? Well, maybe, it's a vision, but it's still within the way that the Jews understood worship. In the Old Testament, the sacrificial system, they needed salt for their sacrifices, so maybe that's why the swamps are still there. I'm going to come back to another reason on that in a little bit. But as we look at this scene, what are we supposed to take away from something like this? I'm going to suggest that, first of all, a passage like this foreshadows Jesus. And if we ask ourselves the question, where is the source of this river? What's the direction of its flow? And what's the manner of its flow? I think we're going to see a lot of things that parallel the life of Christ. But in this passage, it begins and ends by saying that this water was coming from the temple. It was coming from the sanctuary. This is the dwelling place of God. God dwells in the temple. That's where He is, and it's from that place that this water of life is issuing forth. Did Jesus ever compare Himself to a temple? In John chapter 2, verses 19 through 21, Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." The Jews then said, "It has taken 46 years to build this temple, and will you raise it up in 3 days?" But He was speaking about the temple of His body. And there's other passages that make this same point. That Jesus tabernacled with us. He is the dwelling place of God. Now, if that's true, and you link it with this vision here in Ezekiel 47, do you see one of the lessons from this? That the only place that you're going to find life that will transform things that are dead, the only place that you're going to find it is from Christ. Now, we're in a church setting and we're all supposed to go, yeah, that's right. I do believe that the only thing that ultimately gives me life and ultimately, satisfies me and all that sort of thing is Christ. I need Him very much in my life. Okay, so does your weekly life functionally show that you believe that? Or are you spending more time fixated on all kinds of other things that you think are going to give you more life? If only I had more of this or more of that. And I'm putting a lot more energy and effort into letting that thing come into my life rather than God. Then you only know the right answer, but you're not living it out. That's the first thing. Just notice that the source, all the life that comes to this Dead Sea is coming from the presence of God. But think about the direction of the flow. In verse 8, it's going towards the Dead Sea. This river is going towards that which is dead. The question in the Old Testament was who can go into the temple? And it's not many people, and it would have been a very privileged kind of thing to be able to have access to that temple. But now in this passage, the blessings of the temple are freely going out to that which is dead. Now, does this describe the earthly ministry of Jesus? He would spend time with prostitutes and tax collectors and sinners. Just think about 2 back-to-back stories in the Gospel of John. In John chapter 4, Jesus goes to the woman at the well, and He talks about giving her waters that will lead to eternal life. And He uses this imagery of water. You'll never have to go back to this well again because you're going to have this water that's going to ultimately satisfy you, using this same kind of imagery. And this woman, by societal standards, is disgusting. She's been married to 5 people. She's shacking up with a 6th guy. She's just no good. And she needs to have this rejuvenating water given to her. But compare that to John chapter 3 with Nicodemus. This guy that is one of the elite religious people of the day. And he's the teacher of Israel. He knows his Bible. He's respected. And Jesus even says to him, you need to be born of water and spirit as well. Do you think in a room like this, that we've got some people that before you ever became Christians, your life was pretty respectable? People would have looked at you and gone, I think you're a good person, but you, because you understood what you needed to do for the Lord, you acknowledged that you weren't a good person and that you needed the Lord to save you, but you were still, respectable in society. And then there's others of us who in our background, we did all kinds of things that we're shameful to speak of, but we both all needed the exact same thing. You know what's interesting about the Dead Sea? In this vision, did the Dead Sea already have other rivers coming into it, like the Jordan River? It kept going into it. I forget the name of the hymn, but there's some hymn that does not get sung much, at least in my experience, where it compares a lifeless and dead Christian to the Dead Sea. That even though there's a stream of water that keeps going into the Dead Sea, it keeps receiving fresh water, it keeps killing that fresh water again and again and again. The idea being that you could be like the Dead Sea, and you keep getting ideas that are true when you come to church. You keep learning things that are true that needs to transform your life, but it hasn't transformed your life. You're just like the Dead Sea that keeps taking and taking and taking, but there's no life that you're giving to anything else. Now think about this in your life. Are there other streams that you're trying to find life from? The stream of popularity, the stream of wealth and money and education, the stream of influence, the stream. What is it that you think, if it's guided into your heart, will be the thing that gives you life? It's not until the Dead Sea gets this river coming into it that it finally transforms. Reminds me of Romans chapter 5, verse 5. God's love has been poured into our hearts through the Holy Spirit who has been given to us. You want to know the one thing that if you really came to believe it, if I really came to believe it, and it really penetrated my heart, and it really affected the way that I feel and think and act, the one thing that's going to transform me into something that's life-giving, that will sustain that life-giving nature, is for me to embrace how much God has loved me. And when I'm strengthened and fueled by His love for me, then I will be able to sustain life and give life to other people. All right, so you see the picture of this. So the source of the flow, it comes from God. It goes towards things that are dead. We were dead. We needed Jesus. But notice the manner of the flow. In verse 2, it just started as a small trickle. And nobody would have guessed that if you go 1 1/3 mile down, it's going to become this giant river. You keep going further down, and it's going to go into the Dead Sea and transform it. How many of you, by looking at the earthly ministry of Jesus, could have ever predicted that 2,000 years later, right now, we'd be worshiping Him and thinking about Him? Walks around with 12 uneducated, common, ordinary men. Never did a lot of international travel, because after all, that's when you know that your work is really important. He kind of stayed generally around one part of the world during his ministry. Never wrote a book. If you lived in the first century and you saw Jesus and his band of followers walking down the road, and they walked past a Roman military outpost, and you thought to yourself, I wonder which movement's going to last longer, the Roman Empire or that band of 13 people that just walked by me. Everybody would have said the Roman Empire. And look where we are now. Ask yourself this question: what kinds of things impress you? Are you really impressed with flashy and earthly success? Or do you understand that the true power comes from things that seem insignificant? That you give it enough time, you give it enough patience, those are the things that are truly powerful. Look at the life of Christ. If we are the kind of people that are only impressed with what the world is impressed with, we never would have been impressed with Jesus. We would have just looked at Him and gone, that's just a trickle, there's no point in going down the road to see what happens. But those who know that it's coming from God know that there's something else going on. It's not just that this passage foreshadows Christ and what He's done for us. This passage also foreshadows Christians. Think about the source of the flow. Does the Bible ever compare Christians to something like a temple or to something that has water flowing out of it? In John chapter 7, verses 37 and 38, if anyone thirsts, let him come to me and drink. Now notice very carefully what He says. Whoever believes in me, as the Scripture has said. Where does it say this? Out of his heart will flow rivers of living water. This is in the context of the Feast of Booths, when the Jewish people would have gone down to the Kindred Valley and they would have poured out buckets of water on the temple grounds in anticipation of this time where God is going to pour out His Spirit and bring the blessings that the Old Testament prophesied about. And here Jesus is saying, all right, you guys are waiting for those blessings to come. If anyone's thirsty, you got these deep needs in your life. You've got need for meaning. You've got a need for hope. You've got a need for identity. You've got a need, these deep needs that you've tried to have filled from all kinds of other things, but you're still the Dead Sea. If anybody's thirsty, come to me and drink. And if you do, what's going to come out of your heart? Rivers of living water. Do you realize that God has set you up in your work, in your school, in your spheres of influence to be a place where dead people can find life? You are not the chief source of it, you're a conduit of it. But I think about the book of Acts, how in Acts chapter 8, the Christians are scattered, they're persecuted, and then they go everywhere preaching the word. Ask yourself the question that if some great persecution came across the United States and we were all scattered from each other, would we really go everywhere preaching the word? Going towards that which is dead, going towards that which has no life. The picture in the Bible that we have of Christians, without getting into all the details of Isaiah 32 verse 2 says, like streams of water in a dry place, referring to the princes of the king, referring, I think, to Christians here. There's a time when I was living in California, there was a guy at the church who had his own private plane. Wasn't that cool? And there's one day he was like, hey, Eric, do you want to ride in my private plane with me? And I'm like, yeah, that sounds cool. And so he owned a property in a town called Calexico. And I hope this isn't too confusing, but there's two cities across the border, Mexico and California. The California side is called Calexico because it's in California, but it's by Mexico. And then if you cross the border, it's called Mexicali because it's in Mexico, but it's by California. So Calexico, Mexicali. All right, cool. So he had this property in Calexico, and it was like a 45-minute plane flight from his little hangar. And we went into his hangar, and we were flying, and it's all desert. From San Diego over to Calexico, it's desert, desert, desert. And I kept looking down as we were flying. Just dirt, 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 and then suddenly a bunch of farms. And I said to the guy, why is there suddenly a bunch of farms here? And he said, well, in the early 1900s, the Colorado River was diverted to bring agriculture to this part of California. Do you see the picture? We've been getting a lot of rain lately, and so we don't live in a place that makes this as vivid to us, perhaps, as it does in the Bible geography. But imagine living in a place that's desert, and the only way anything ever turns green is when you get a little bit of rain during the winter months. All around you, in your workplace, perhaps in your family, in your school, you are surrounded by people who are in a desert that have nothing to drink. They don't know what it is that really will satisfy them. And God has set you up in these different places to be rivers of living water. But it's only going to be those who really believe in Him and really drink from Him. And those people will have the information and the vitality and the life to be able to give it to other people. And you might look at a vision like this and go, that's right, let's start conquering Bowling Green. Let's get together 2 by 2, like we talked about in Bible class, and let's start teaching a whole bunch of people. Let's do everything tomorrow. Well, remember the manner of the flow. It starts out small, and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Now, like the parable of the mustard seed. Now, apply this to yourself individually. Would you like to see yourself one day as being the kind of Christian that can help other people, that people can go to for advice, that people can get nourishment from and strength from, that you can have the right words to say and the timing? Would you like to become somebody that can serve other people and be helpful? That's right, yeah, I want to be that kind of person. Okay, how does it happen? I probably just have to read like one book and I'm there, right? No? It's small disciplines. Every time you've got a question that you don't know the answer to, you go to somebody who knows more than you do and you talk to that person. Every time you are confronted with some sin in your heart that you didn't realize was there, you put the work in to put that to death. And cumulatively, after all this time and energy and effort, you will become somebody that nobody could have predicted that you'd have become. Because you never despised small things. You had the humility to learn small things wherever you could, and that adds up to becoming an elder one day. And that adds up to becoming a more effective deacon. That adds up to becoming a woman like Dorcas in Acts chapter 9, who blessed so many people with her life. But you start with small things and you don't despise them. What about a simple, small invitation? I think about the Gerasene demoniac guy in Mark chapter 5 that had, all the demons that go into the pigs? And he's begging to come with Jesus. And Jesus says, no, you got one message to go tell people in Decapolis. Go tell everybody how much the Lord has done for you. Oh, that's it? Okay, the very simple thing, guys, I don't have much to say, but the Lord has done a lot for me. This is what the Lord's done for me. This is what the Lord's done for me. Or, very small thing that he has to say, but look at what it does to Decapolis next time Jesus gets there in Mark chapter 7. There's a big crowd waiting for him. Or I think about in John chapter 4, the woman at the well, and she goes back to Samaria with one message. Come meet a guy who told me all the things that I ever did. Come meet a guy who told me all the things that I ever did. She doesn't have a lot of depth of theological understanding of everything. She doesn't know all the books memorized and everything. She's got one thing to go tell people. And it transforms a city. Is there one person that you might not know all the things that you could say to them, but just one person that you could say, hey, just come and read the Bible with me. Hey, there's this Bible study that's already going on during the week. Come on to it. Hey, do you want to start a new Bible study? We can get some people to teach it or whatever. We got somebody to host it. Just start small. What about a small word of encouragement that you can give to somebody? The reason why, before I ever even thought about preaching, I already had my career picked out and my plan figured out. I was going to finish school. There was a Christian in New Mexico that owned a firm, and I was going to go down there and start working for them after I was done with my education. And then Andy Cantrell, who I met with every week, pulled me aside one day and said, hey, have you thought about preaching? And I said, no, I really don't want to do that. He said, well, you should think about doing that. And that one conversation now has turned into 13 years of preaching. What are some small words of encouragement that you could give to somebody? Since I've been preaching, there's been a couple times that I've gotten this close to just quitting altogether. And one of the things that I've done at times is people have written me cards that thanking me for whatever, and I have all three of them in my office. And whenever I get discouraged, I go back and I'll look at those and go, okay, maybe I'll just keep doing this. I don't know. What's a small encouragement that you could give to somebody? We all have our cell phones. We scroll on it, social media, looking at the Facebook marketplace. When was the last time you took it out and sent it seems so small. What's it really going to do to somebody? You don't know what it could do to somebody. But Christians don't despise small things. We know that from the Scriptures. Because we understand that if something is from God and of God, no matter how small it might seem, it can grow and become much more than you ever thought it could. And as long as I don't have a mindset that despises small things, we can get a lot of things done with the Lord's help as we're doing the small things that are right in front of us. Now, I said earlier that in this text there were the swamps and marshes, and maybe they're left there for the salt for the sacrifices. But maybe there's another reason that the swamps and marshes are left in this text. Maybe it's because it pictures how some people react to this stream of water that's coming right into their back doors. There's some people that because of their impenitent heart, because of their stony heart, they can hear every week, and I'm not talking about the people that are outside these walls right now. I'm talking about potentially you coming here every week, singing hymns that are getting God's word deeper into your heart, hearing Bible classes and sermons that are aiming at the same thing. You can come here every week and be a stick in the mud. You've got this life-giving water flowing right past you, and you go, you know what? I'm going to keep on with my idolatry. You know what? I'm going to keep trying to get life from these other sources. And okay, you'll go ahead and keep being salt, not in the good way. I urge you to not be a swamp or a marsh, but to open up the channel of your heart and know that the only stream that will give you life is that which comes from God. We're about to sing the song, Is Thy Heart Right with God? And one of the ways that you know that is whenever you hear something that challenges you, whenever you hear something that you haven't been doing, is your heart the kind of heart that says, today I will repent. I will not harden my heart today. But I'll change what needs to be changed. I'll start with the small disciplines. I won't despise these things. I will grow to eventually become more helpful than I am right now, but I'm going to trust that it takes time. And it starts with small things. If there's anybody that needs to start by making the small step towards coming to the Lord and being baptized into Him, this is an opportunity for you to do that. But if you've fallen away and you've become a marsh, invite the fresh waters to come back in and transform you while we stand and while we sing.